Welcome back to the fourth episode of Thinking Through the Darkness, a lore by Spec production, with me, your host, Spec. Let's get the shilling out of the way as normal. If you haven't been following my YouTube channels where I post all of my Kingdom Hearts theories, type lore by Spec into YouTube and it'll bring you to my page. You'll find weekly drops of Kingdom Hearts theories there. We also have this podcast, Thinking Through the Darkness, which is the pre-production, where I talk through my thoughts, my theories, my ramblings, my ruminations, of everything that goes into a theory before it reaches you guys on video. If you like this work and want to support it, subscribing to the YouTube, commenting, and subscribing is the best way to tell the algorithm that you want to see more of my stuff. For this podcast, wherever you are listening to it, be it Spotify, Amazon, Apple Podcasts, being sure to follow the podcast and to write a review always helps. Leaving comments always works. That helps to boost the podcast up in its rankings. And if you want to financially support this podcast and the channel itself, I have a Ko-Fi, which is in the description below. Any contributions really help to keeping all of this alive. So, with all of that out of the way, let's dive into what I want to be pacing around and talking about today, which is this notion that Xehanort has been labelled a scapegoat. And this comes from me digging into the secret reports, specifically 12 and 13 from Luxu. Because we've seen a progressive theme in Kingdom Hearts 3 and Remind that potentially Xehanort's whole purpose in this is not what it seems, and is not what it has been led to believe. And I'm going to start by diving in and reading these two reports, and then going into the bits that I find interesting. So, Secret Report 12. Even on a world line with no Keyblade, peace is but a dream. In absence of us and our master, a quote darkness arrived, one that will surely lead the world to yet another demise. Amid the chaos, I bequeathed my Keyblade to one of the Union leaders, just as the master instructed. I watched as the 5 were sent to another world line, at no small cost, ensuring the line of Keyblade wielders would live on. And now, Keybladeless, I must depart this land to fulfill my final task. This means casting my body aside and soldering my heart in a vessel after vessel, as many as it takes, but I will continue gazing upon each passing era, one unto the next. In time, be it years, decades, centuries, or millennia, I will meet the 5 once more. Somewhere in this cyclical history of bequeathings, a chosen one will appear and reenact the Keyblade War. When this scapegoat arrives and takes my Keyblade in hand, this will be the time to take the stage and finish my role. The Lost Masters will awaken. Secret Report 13. It seems this body, this name will be my last. The lives I have lived over the ages could fill volumes, but for now, I must focus on what matters most. The Keyblade has been successfully passed down, generation to generation, and it seems a Keyblade master devoted to the darkness may finally arrive. Until now, I have watched over the course of events from a distance. Perhaps the time has come to intervene. I need only play the role of a fool delirious of the Keyblade's power. I will don the mask of his ally in order to watch over my Keyblade from close by, the gazing eye, a keyblade forged from the eye of the Master of Masters. He passed it to me, as I have to others, and through it he can see the future, all that will come to pass, spanning ages in a body after body, life after life. My task has been to keep vigil over the eye as it passes from hand to hand. It has been a long time, longer than I can express. But now, at last, the Keyblade War has begun, and Kingdom Hearts will open. A true and complete Kingdom Hearts, born of the clash between darkness and light. I will soon be reunited with my old companions, and in that moment, my long vigil will reach its end. He will return. So I think I want to primarily focus on Secret Report 12, because there's a lot to dig in here. There's a few things that strike me as odd in that report. So we know that Luxu bequeathed his Keyblade to Brain, because we see that happen in Union Cross. I watched as 5 were sent to other world lines at no small cost. At no small cost. Obviously, we know that the Ark itself has a cost to use. But it's interesting that Luxu would even care to comment about something like that. Like, why exactly would he care if he had not intervened in general to make sure that Keyblades could be passed down? He has only had one role, well, 2 really, which is mind the box and make sure that the Keyblade gets passed down from person to person. It's odd that he would comment or care to comment about the cost involved for people unrelated to that task. But yet he makes a point of pausing about that. And my instinct is to not dismiss that. My instinct is to say that there is something about that he felt was extraordinary or unnecessary. Because he too manages to leave that collapsing timeline, and not in an arc, but through some other method, some other means. Meaning that in many ways, he is aware of something or of a way to leave that the other union leaders at the time either didn't have access to or weren't aware of. And that's an interesting perspective, I think. The next thing it talks about is how it could certainly be many millennia has passed up until the current events. Like, we are many millennia ahead, which would make sense as to why Keyblade wielders are in itself so sparse. When we think about how rampant Keyblade wielders were in the age of fairy tales, it's always struck me as odd that it's really only come down to, like, at max 15 people left in the entire universe who have access to these powers that are actually quite essential to still have. But he specifically calls out in this report the cyclical history of bequeathings. And I want to take that apart a little bit. Because yes, it could mean the cycle of bequeathing itself. But note he didn't say tradition of bequeathing. He said cyclical, which means it's a cycle, which means ultimately everything ends up getting returned back to where it originally was. It doesn't really have an end point. To quote the Stanley Parable, the end is never the end. But to imply that bequeathing is inherently cyclical in nature would imply a couple of things at the same time. That ultimately there is an alpha and an omega, where things begin and where things end. That Keyblade powers are inherently only ever temporary. And we have seen that. We've seen it in Xion and Roxas not being able to share the Kingdom Key at the same time because it really belonged to Sora. We have seen Riku take Kingdom Key from Sora because it originally was meant to go to him. And I am sitting with this notion of what does that mean? Because we haven't had a point of origin in this franchise yet from a holistic historical perspective. Like nobody has sat down with us and been like, this is where everything started, right? It sort of implied in Union Cross that this is where things started. But really, we're only at the tail end of the beginning of that story, right? If we're meant to have been treating Union Cross as the Genesis, we only ever really got to the 7th day of Genesis, where we didn't really get to see days 1 through 6, if that makes sense. And that, to me, I conversely understand the two sides of that. Of you always want to tell the most interesting part of any story. But equally, if we don't have an origin point, then it makes the stakes of that somewhat ungraspable. Because we don't really know, in essence, whether there was stuff that came before the Foretellers and the Master of Masters. Because we only ever really got to the end. We only ever really got to the point of understanding that the Master of Masters has made this decision for whatever reason, and we don't know what reason that is, but whatever reason, to decide that it should all collapse in a Keyblade War. But we don't know the whys, and we don't know how he's gotten to the conclusion that he's gotten to. But to imply that it is cyclical implies that there is knowledge that we are midway through that cycle. We are neither at the beginning nor at the end. And then it says a chosen one will appear and reenact the Keyblade War. The chosen one, in this particular instance, I believe they're talking about Xehanort, which Dark Road implied, the end of Union Cross implied that it was indeed Xehanort. But the word reenact is tripping me up here. Because a reenactment is by and large fake. A reenactment is a telling. It is a staged event. It is a play. It is a story. It is a depiction of events that have already occurred. It's not the real thing. That's what a reenactment is. You know, if you go and see Macbeth, if you go and see Wicked, if you go and see The Importance of Being Earnest, if you go and see Rent, if you go and see the Moulin Rouge, Chicago, they're all going to contain the same characters, the same story, the same series of events, but they're all going to be played by different actors with slightly different interpretation of words or songs or body language or expression that makes each of those unique but not necessarily faithful. Because reenactment is highly dependent on interpretation. It's highly dependent on who's being positioned in the play. And I'm curious how something fake with a scapegoat, because that's what the next sentence starts with, when this scapegoat. How can a fake Keyblade War, a reenactment of a Keyblade War with a scapegoat, two false things, can summon the real Kingdom Hearts? How can that be true? How is it possible for something that is reenacted, that is a portrayal, facilitated by a scapegoat, how could that have facilitated Kingdom Hearts unless it's got something to do with the Keyblade graveyard itself being the most important thing in order for Kingdom Hearts to open, not necessarily the reenactment? And I feel like that's something that's pretty much glossed over, is that this is a reenactment. This is a play. This is, you don't go to Macbeth, for example, and when there's murders that occur, you expect real people to actually die. Because it's a reenactment. It's a play. Let me see what the actual dictionary of reenactment. Right. So reenactment is the educational or recreational restaging of historical events. Reenact, meaning to act out, perform, or repeat actions of a past event, scene, or incident, often to help people remember it or for entertainment. Let me see what Merriam-Webster wants to say. Reenact. To enact something such as a law again, to act or perform, to repeat the actions of an earlier event or incident. So for all intents and purposes, this is implying that what we witnessed in Kingdom Hearts 3 is not a real Keyblade War, purely due to the word reenacted. Because otherwise, wouldn't this be considered the third Keyblade War? Or the second Keyblade War? I'm saying third because technically I'm counting the events at the end of Birth by Sleep. Though you couldn't really consider that a war. That was more of just a fight. But an enactment is not the same as an actual war. So why would you be playing the roles of the Keyblade War? I'm not sure. But this does imply that what we have witnessed and what we have partaken in isn't a real event. It is an enactment of an event in order for a certain circumstance to arise. But it's not real. It's manufactured in some way. When the scapegoat arrives and takes my Keyblade in hand, this will be the time to take stage and finish my role. So, I want to take apart this sentence in a few different ways. When this scapegoat arrives and takes my Keyblade in hand, it's interesting that all I have in my head right now is what Benny says to the courier at the start of Fallout New Vegas, which is, sorry you got caught up in this scene. For you, it must seem like a 18-carat run of bad luck. But the truth is, the game was rigged from the start. And it makes me think of the depiction of the armour in the last battle with Xehanort and Sora. His armoured form is a black goat. The pieces on the board in the boys' chess game, Xehanort's piece is also a goat. But Scapegoat itself has a very specific meaning, right? So going back to Merriam-Webster, scapegoat, a goat upon whose head are symbolically placed the sins of the people which he sent into the wilderness in the biblical ceremony for Yom Kippur. The one that bears the blame of others and the one of the object of irrational hostility. To say the scapegoat makes something very clear, is that Xehanort has certainly been put in the position here as being the antagonist, when Luxu's making it very clear that that's not the actual case. Sure, Xehanort had his own goals and objectives through this, but ultimately he was working as being the object that's moved, so somebody else doesn't have to. A scapegoat is where somebody gets the blame for something that isn't their responsibility. But we see Xehanort do all of these things. We see him act this way and enact all of these schemes. And yet he is positioned here, as far as the Lost Masters are concerned, of they are the Lost Masters' scapegoat. So if they're not willing to take the blame for something, that normally implies that there is somebody else above them who could get scolded or reprimanded should they get the blame. And that's what the word scapegoat implies. That if the Lost Masters and the Masters of Masters are looking at Xehanort as a scapegoat, somebody of which they can attribute blame so they don't have to take it, that would mean that there is consequences for the Master of Masters and the Lost Masters of the events that they are trying to enact here. They are trying to not get the blame for something, because there is naturally, that would imply that there is something above them that they are meant to be upholden to. Something that obviously the actions that we have seen Xehanort do would not fall within the supposed actions that or behaviors that they are meant to be abiding by. That's what this implies. And I've said it in many a theory of who watches the Watchmen, right? But this is the first inference point we actually see where there is a possibility here that I'm not wrong about there must be some other force at work here that is meant to be looking over the Master of Masters and the Lost Masters. Because why would they need a scapegoat for their schemes if they were doing everything above board and without fear of something, what's the word? Retaliation. Where they fear retaliation of something. Why else have a scapegoat? Doesn't really make any sense. The next thing is pointing to Luxu's hubris, which is, and takes my Keyblade in hand. That Keyblade was never Luxu's. That Keyblade has always been the Master of Masters. It's never been Luxu's. It has the Master's eye in it, and he was given it by the Master. It's not Luxu's Keyblade. It's the Master's Keyblade. And takes my Keyblade in hand. This will be the time to take the stage and finish my role. We still don't really know or have any clarification as to what that means to take the stage and finish his role. But look at how he phrases that. It will be time to take the stage with my Keyblade. This is not about him being subservient or doing what he's meant to do. This is him having his moment of being like, ha ha ha, look how clever I am. Otherwise, I'll put it to you this way. If you were putting a letter in a post box that you were putting in the mail, I don't think anybody would consider you going on stage to be like, look at how I am placing this letter in this post box. Look at how grand I am. You would just put the letter in the post box. There's something about this that is making him level this up from being just a simple action, a task that is completed, to something that is centered around him, where he feels like this needs to be centered around him. And that's dangerous because this has never been about any of the Lost Masters. This has never been about any of the Foretellers. This has always been about the Master of Masters. This has never, ever, and the Master of Masters has never, ever allowed anybody else to be the smartest person in the room. So this is going to come and bite him in the ass. I know it. I just know it will. So I'm curious as to what dissecting this means. And is it possible that placing Xehanort as the scapegoat is actually going to wind up with them doing what they thought would occur? Because my instinct is to say no. We have seen Xehanort do unbelievable feats, complex things in a relatively short amount of time. Aside from the time hopping, he's accomplished all of this linearly in about 80 years. That's a very short amount of time for something so complex, something that has so many moving parts. And we need to think about how, at the end of Kingdom Hearts 3, he does kind of just give up. And I've never not thought about that as being anything other than sus. Him sort of just becoming out of breath, and Sora having the X-Blade and just being like, it's over, give up. And he has always been sus to me. Because we have never seen him back down. That and the fact that he ends this with very well done. That's not someone a villain says to their adversary. That's something a teacher says to a student. That's something that you are preparing someone for. That's not animosity. That's not villain behavior. Don't get me wrong, it's not good guy behavior either, but it's not villain behavior either. You would expect somebody with a level of intellect and foresight that Xehanort has, that he would be raging against the night if something truly turned out in a way that was unacceptable to his plans. And I don't believe for a second that they have put the name of Scapegoat onto Xehanort without really knowing what he's fully capable of. And with the drawings and sketches that we've seen of Xehanort in more recent times and his participation in Melody of Memory, you would be a fool to think that we will never see him again in the franchise. I think he still has a role to play, not necessarily as an antagonist, but someone who ends up getting more revealed as time goes on. But I think that that's where we'll leave it for today's podcast. I hope you all enjoyed it. As normal, you can find all the links to everything I do in the description below. Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe if you're on YouTube. If you're on your favorite podcast app, don't forget to review and leave a comment there. And if you want to support this podcast, my Ko-Fi is the best way to help me keep the lights on and pay for all the subs that help keep this podcast going. So I hope you all have a great rest of your time zone, and I'll see you in the next one.